Hello, and welcome to the Office of the Patriot. My name is Myron Ybarra, and I'm your host. If you're a returning viewer, welcome back, and thank you for your continued viewership. It's appreciated. Today's topic is a bit out of my wheelhouse, but things have happened in my life recently that have prompted me to discuss this topic. However, if I'm being completely honest, it's not something I relish talking about because it's going to require me to resurrect some dark times in my life that I put behind me some time ago. C'est la vie, and you only live once. So here we go. Today's discussion is about grace, and more specifically, forgiveness. I usually define what I'm going to talk about before diving in, and today is no exception. According to Merriam-Webster, grace is disposition to or an act of kindness, courtesy, or clemency. As I see it, grace is the physical act of clemency, courtesy, and kindness, while forgiveness is the emotional counterpart. I've had these conversations in the past with close friends and family regarding the idea of forgiveness and grace. And much of the time, most of these conversations lead nowhere. If people felt they'd been wronged and or injured by another party or parties, then forgiveness and grace was not likely something they were interested in giving, especially if the wounds were fresh. The primary reasons for not forgiving someone were varied. Some said they had been a bigger person before and forgave and continued to be victimized by the same person. Or the guilty party or parties needed to apologize to them before they would even consider forgiveness. Or the injuries were too severe and thus the perpetrators were not worthy of forgiveness and grace. So, to be honest or to be clear, I do believe that there are some trespasses from which there can be no redemption. However, when it comes to family, in my humble opinion, these trespasses would have to be very immoral. Why do I say that? Well, because I've found that most people who feel they've been victimized tend to remember only the instances in their past where their emotions are heightened, both good and bad. These events are often exaggerated and thus difficult to recall as a result of time and the emotions that are tied to the event. As an example, my wife and I went to virtually every game or school competition that our children were involved in. In fact, we became a fixture at all of our children's extracurricular activities. If you asked them to recall every single instance where we attended, they wouldn't be able to. However, if you asked them to recall any specific event, they would likely remember the times where they excelled and the times where they failed. Our job was to beam with pride and cheer for their successes or to console them when they were defeated so they could rebound and do better in our next event. Had we not been there, I believe my children's memories of these successes would not have been as sweet and their failures would have been even more bitter. I say this because when we're angry or hurt, we tend to put a lot of emphasis on our injury and how we feel about that injury. However, we forget the routine day-to-day events that give us joy and contentment, much like our kids not remembering each event my wife and I attended, only the special ones. The overemphasis of negative feelings that are the result of injury lead to anger and then to victimhood, which is the antithesis of grace and forgiveness. I also found that when you try to convince someone who feels that they've been injured and as a result is angry, that forgiving, or rather that giving grace and forgiveness is the best way to unburden their heart, you'll likely be met with, you don't know what it's like, or you haven't lived my life, or you don't know the situation. And all that is true. However, I, like many other people in the world, am no stranger to injury and to tragedy. And to prove a point, here's one of my life stories, and I'll let you be the judge. So comment below on what you would have done had you been in this same situation. So my father was in the United States Air Force, and he was a hard worker and a strict hands-on disciplinarian. Like most military men back then, he smoked like a chimney, drank like a fish, and was the epitome of the alpha male of the household. My mother, on the other hand, was the doting, submissive housewife. She raised 3 boys, worked part-time on each base we moved to, and she was actively involved with the NCO Wives Club, learning how to macrame or embroider, glaze ceramics, decorate cakes, paint murals, and in all of her free time, she managed to be a den mother to myself and my brothers when we were in the Cub Scouts. And she didn't drink or smoke like my father. Back then, coffee was her only vice. There was nothing really unusual about our family except for the fact that we were a military family and discipline was at the family core. However, things began to change in my father's behavior. He was angry a lot of the time, and as a result, he started drinking more and thus became even more angry and more hands-on when he was disciplining. My mother did her best to try to keep the family together, and to rekindle her relationship with my father, so she began involving herself in the things that my father did to keep the peace, smoking and drinking. Ultimately, though, this led to the demise of the relationship and the separation of our family. I went with my mother to California. That's where she was originally from, and my two brothers stayed with my father in Texas. This happened just as I was getting out of the 8th grade. My mother's family always impressed upon my mother the responsibilities of a wife, which meant staying with your husband no matter what. So when she left and looked to her family for help, most of them abandoned her. And because I was with her, I was collateral damage of that abandonment. So for 2 months, we lived in her car until an extended family member took my mom and I in. In that time, she was able to get herself together, find work, and get us an apartment. However, given that she had just a high school education and no marketable skills beyond manual labor, work prospects were minimal. She eventually found work and lived paycheck to paycheck for about 3 years with me. And her drinking and her smoking increased during this time because of her situation. And given that she was going through her own personal hell, I was left to my own devices. Fortunately, I had the discipline that I received early on that allowed me to see that drugs and gangs, which were prevalent where we lived, was not an avenue I wanted to travel. So to avoid them, I just stopped going to school and hung out at home. Eventually, my mother met my future stepfather. He too was a hard worker and a strict disciplinarian, but he was also successful in that he was working for the California Department of Corrections as a correctional officer back in the early 80s. The two hit it off really well, and it appeared my mom had turned a corner. However, her new boyfriend made it pretty clear that he wasn't interested in raising kids again. So, my mom was left with a choice of dissolving the relationship and going back to her previous life with me, or sending me away. And she chose the latter. So, I took a bus and went back to my father in Texas. I asked him to stay so I could just finish school. And he told me no, and sent me back on the bus back to California. So I got back to California and I walked from the bus station to my mother's apartment, and I got there in the early evening. I knocked on the door and my mother answered, and I asked to come in, and I told her I had nowhere else to go. And she told me at that time I could not stay with them anymore, and then closed the door on me. For a little over a month, I was homeless. I slept in an abandoned apartment complex approximately a block away from where my mom and her boyfriend lived. I would sleep in the apartment at night, and during the day, I would go to friends' houses to eat and to clean up. And this worked for a while. However, one day I went to the apartment and saw that it was reboarded up, and I had no way to get back in. So I went back to my mom's apartment. I remember it was really late at night, right around 11 p.m. or so. So I didn't knock on the door because I knew they had to work, and they were probably asleep, and I didn't want to wake them. So I just unrolled my blanket that I had, and I slept in the carport just in front of their cars. The next morning, my mother's boyfriend, when he was going to work, saw me sleeping in front of the cars and told me to go upstairs to the house and we would talk when he got home. I believe what he meant to say was that he would talk and I would have to listen. I didn't get the opportunity to talk because they had already decided what they were going to do. They told me they would let me stay with them to finish school, and then I would have to enlist in the military. And I agreed because this condition was actually better than I thought would happen. I didn't know what would happen, but I figured, okay, this is fine because I'm actually going to be able to go back to school. So the following week, they took me to the recruiter where I enrolled in the Army's delayed entry program. However, just 2 weeks after my enrollment, and well before I graduated, 2 recruiters knocked on the door just after I got home from school and advised me that my mother had signed the early release form, which allowed them to take me prior to the age of 18. I was instructed to pack a bag and to go with them. This was in 1984. The betrayal and hurt that I felt was all-encompassing. As I look back now, I realize that I leaned on those negative emotions, and at the time, they helped propel me through basic training, AIT, and all the way through my military commitment. I've told this story before to close friends and family who weren't directly involved, and each time I've told it, I would get almost the exact same question. How could you forgive your mom and dad for what they did to you? Well, at first I didn't. The hate gave me purpose. I would not cave in. I would not be beaten, not by her, not by anyone. However, I also learned that while hating my mother and father hurt them, it hurt me too. I became cynical and untrusting of anyone. Heavy is the heart that carries the burden of hate. So I chose to forgive them both, to extend the grace that was not given to me. And I learned through this process that forgiving them wasn't just for them, it was for me too. You see, I was so wrapped up in the injuries I received as a result of my mother and father's decisions that I forgot all the wonderful things they did for me in my early childhood. And while these wonderful things can't excuse the bad things, I chose to spend my time focusing on the good things, which put me in a better place and allowed me to extend grace and thus forgiveness. I found that forgiveness doesn't just help the people you extend grace to, it helps and heals you as well. It's both a selfless and a selfish act. As I said before, I don't know everyone's situation. However, I do know that even extreme wrongs can and should be forgiven. Extending forgiveness to someone, especially family, when you have been wronged, is the height of grace. And more often than not, you'll be better off doing so. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. If you did, please consider subscribing, smashing that like button, and sharing my channel on your social media. And as always, have a great day and stay safe out there.